All right, let's talk a little bit about frames per second. Generally, when people say frames per second, usually they're talking about one of two things. They're either talking about movies or they're talking about PCs. What this video is going to be doing is talking about what frames per second is, how it relates to human perception, what it has to do with filmmaking, and what it has to do with something called motion blur. Okay, the first thing that we're going to be focusing on is what frames per second is. I covered this a little bit in a different video, but generally speaking, when we talk about frames per second, we're talking about it in terms of apparent motion. So whenever you see something on TV, it's not actually moving. What you're seeing is generally a certain number of images displayed in very quick succession so that you can perceive it as it is moving. That's apparent motion. Most movies are filmed somewhere between 24 frames per second, which used to be kind of the standard, to about 29 frames per second or thereabouts. Now, one question that comes up is that the minimum threshold? Is that, or can we perceive more than 30 frames per second? Yes, we can definitely perceive more than 30 frames per second. We know this because of Peter Jackson. And if you're not familiar with Peter Jackson, he was the director of Lord of the Rings. He was director of King Kong. He was director of Dead Alive and Bad Taste and Meet the Feebles and Heavenly Creatures and lots of other good and mediocre movies. Peter Jackson loves special effects. He loves special effects. That's his background. And he's been really interested in how can we make special effects in movies better. And so in the past several years, he worked to develop the RED camera and things like that. He thought his next big breakthrough was going to be high frame rate projection. In other words, he was going to take cameras and where they normally capture 24 frames per second, he was going to bump that up to about 48 frames per second. And that was going to revolutionize movies. And people noticed it. Yeah, people noticed it. They did not like it. So he kind of unveiled this on the first Hobbit movie. So in the first Hobbit movie, if you were unfortunate enough to see it on opening night or that opening weekend, you may have gone to the theater super excited, gotten to your super expensive, movie theater with, high frame rate projection and all this other stuff. And what you saw was kind of awful looking. And I'm not just saying this based on my opinion. Lots of other people pointed this out, that The Hobbit looks really, really cheap, which is crazy because The Hobbit had a huge budget and it was filmed using cutting-edge technology. But here's the rub. By showing it at a faster frame rate, by showing it at double the frame rate that audiences were used to, it didn't look more realistic. It looked faker. Now this is strange because it's the exact opposite of what you would expect. Because by filming it at 48 frames per second, you're getting it closer to reality, so to speak. You're getting in more images into 1 second, and that should look smoother. It should look more realistic, and it does look smoother. However, our eye has been trained to watch movies. Whenever we watch television, when we watch movies, we're prepared for a certain kind of experience. And what we saw with The Hobbit violated that. It did not look like movies. It looked like something else. So a lot of people said that it looked really cheap. A lot of people said that it looked like a soap opera almost. You could kind of see the makeup and it felt like a set and things like that. So that was a huge bust. People did not like high frame rate HFPS. People didn't like it. And so for the most part, we don't really do that stuff anymore. You'll notice this sometimes a little bit whenever you have a new TV and you're kind of getting the settings right. Sometimes certain channels will look really fake, and part of the reason for that is because it's displaying at a different frames per second than what your TV might be expecting, and so you can go in there and adjust the settings and get it to work out. So the minimum kind of frames per second that it takes for us to be able to actually perceive motion is generally about 18 frames per second. Anything lower than that and it doesn't really look like it's actually moving. It looks like it's kind of a stutter stop move around. It doesn't look fluid. So Well, what happens after 30 frames per second? If you're a PC gamer, you know the gold standard is 60 frames per second. 60 frames per second is generally what most computers, they like to advertise. This is being shown at 60 frames per second. PC gamers will look down on Xbox gamers and PlayStation gamers because usually those will run at about 30 frames per second, which is a little bit more cinematic in a way, but it's not more realistic, so to speak. More realistic would be 60 frames per second. And why is that the standard, though? Can the human eye perceive beyond 60 frames per second? Yes, kinda. It's tricky, it's tough. Because this is going to make us, so we need to kind of distinguish a couple of things here before we move any further, because what I'm about to say is going to piss some people off. Yes, we can perceive more than 60 frames per second, but it doesn't really matter. So here's what I mean. Whenever you go over 60 frames per second, the human eye has a harder time noticing increases in frames per second. So from 60 to 70 frames per second, you probably can't tell the difference. From 60 to 1,000 frames per second, you can probably tell a difference there. But from 60 to 70, 70 to 80, you can't really. From 60 to 80, from 60 to 90, not really so much. There's usually around the 48 frames per second to 60 frames per second is usually when we start to get much worse at detecting higher frames per second. So 60 is kind of a good cutoff point because we have severe diminishing returns after that. Now, that's not the reason why computers use 60 frames per second. Is because of the refresh rate on most monitors, or about 60 hertz, in other words, about 60 frames per second, so that they couldn't really display more than that, so that if you had a game running at 120 frames per second and your monitor was only 60 hertz or whatever, it wouldn't matter. You're only still showing 60 frames per second as all that your display device was able to show. Okay, so here's where it gets tricky. When we start talking about detecting things, though, there have been studies that show that fighter pilots, so people who are trained to make very quick, fast visual discriminations, can notice things in about 1 out of 250 50th seconds. So if you take a second and you divide it up into 250, individual slices, and you took one of those slices and you inserted an object into one of those 250 slices, that a fighter pilot would be able to pick up on that. They would notice that something entered their field of view. That's beyond the threshold for most human beings without that special kind of training. So it is possible to get something like that. But if you took a pilot and you showed them video at 250 frames per second, and then showed them another video at 270 frames per second, they wouldn't be able to tell you the difference between those two things. That study that references the fighter pilots, which is brought up a lot with PC gamers, is only really looking at change detection, which is something a little bit different than looking at apparent motion and looking at discriminations in apparent motion. So to show you a little bit about what audiences were kind of responding to with The Hobbit, and why it looked fake, what I'm going to do is I'm going to show you these two moving objects right here. So what you see is a nice background, and you see two objects that are moving back and forth, left to right. So these are both moving at 24 frames per second, and they have the typical motion blur that we normally see on camera. Whenever you see something move across at a fast speed on camera, it has a little bit of a blur. But you notice that this blur doesn't actually exist. If I were to take my phone and just throw it, actually it probably did blur a little bit because you're actually seeing this on the computer. You're seeing a recording of it. But if you were to throw your own phone, you would not detect any kind of visual motion blur there. That's something that's specific to entertainment. What I can do is I can eliminate that motion blur here, and now you see, hey, it looks really weird, right? That doesn't look natural. When in fact, that is actually more realistic, but our eye is not used to seeing things at that kind of setting, and so it appears bizarre to us. And now you can kind of see whenever I move the frames per second from like 45 frames per second to 60 frames per second, you can't really tell that much of a difference. At least not as much of a difference between, let's say, 15 and 30, or 30 to the 45. So that's all that we have time for. That's a little bit of a breakdown of frames per second. And if you're a PC gamer and I made you mad, let me know.